minutes to talk to you about the importance of lactate production. So just in short, in order to go fast and in order to have some speed potential, you have to be able to produce lactate at a very rapid rate. And so that's kind of a function of your inherent ability, capacity to be fast. Now, being fast is relative, right? Being fast for 100 meters versus 10 miles is a little bit different, but in essence, your ability to produce lactate at a very rapid rate determines how much top end speed that you have. How that's important for what we do is you do need to produce lactate, and our body uses that for fuel, but an overproduction and too much rapid accumulation of lactate can get in the way of our performance goals. On the flip side, not enough lactate production can also get in the way of our fitness goals and our race goals. So I want to share with you 3 profiles and kind of show you the differences between each person and let you know how that is impacted in terms of your training. So if we take lactate over here on this axis and we have intensity, it doesn't matter whether it's watts or pace, but as your intensity increases, each dot represents a lactate sample, and these are just 3 made-up examples, but these lactate curves are typical in what I've seen. Okay, so as the intensity increases, I take lactate samples, and your lactate is registered in millimoles of lactate. At rest, most of us are like 1, 1.2, 1.5, maybe 2. And we stay at a pretty low lactate level until our intensity starts to increase. And so what we want to do is we want to test to see where that increase begins. Okay, and anytime you have an increase in lactate, you also have an increase in carbohydrate combustion. Okay, and so if we take a look at this profile in blue, this lactate profile shows that there's very, very little rise in an athlete's lactate until they get to the really top end intensity. But if you notice, the actual top end production of lactate is very, very small. So this athlete here would be very, very aerobic. In other words, they can go on for a long time, and but they just don't have a lot of speed potential. If you ask them to surge up a hill, if you ask them to push power, if you ask them to bridge a gap in let's say a breakaway, they're going to struggle a lot with that. Now, for this athlete, the challenge is going to be not enough speed potential. And so for this athlete, we're going to do things differently to allow them to tap into their lactate production, to build up their lactate production rate. And so the types of training that they might do, they might see more high intensity, like all out, crazy intense intervals that will stimulate a larger lactate production, and train that so that we don't wait until they're at the very end to produce lactate, because lactate production is very important for your ability to speed up. And in this case, this athlete would not be producing enough, and I would want to see them producing a little bit more as they get to their top end. This profile is typically where a lot of endurance athletes fall, and this is as intensity increases, their lactate production increases, and they do have the potential to produce large amounts of lactate, which is good for speed potential. This athlete might be pretty solid at, let's say, a half Ironman Olympic distance. They can push the pace, they can push a lot of intensity, but this profile would definitely show that as an athlete increases their distance, as they go for a longer duration, they're going to struggle a little bit because they're starting to produce lactate at some of the lower intensities. And we want this, let's say they're training for an Ironman, we want the production of lactate down here, we want that to drop a little bit. So the type of training that we're going to have this athlete do is going to be a little bit different from this athlete. This athlete would have maybe longer, more sustained intervals at more of a moderate pace. Okay, let's contrast with this last profile in red, and this indicates somebody from the beginning, from low intensity. As soon as they start pedaling the bike or start running, their lactate levels start to rise very, very rapidly. So this would be an indication of an athlete who's very, very unfit, who has some speed potential. Typically, this is a profile of a male athlete who, let's say, has taken years and years off of training and they're getting back into it, and maybe they have like a high school and college sports background. This would be a very typical profile lactate curve for them. Now, as you can see, as soon as this athlete starts working out, their lactate production increases, which means they're going through a ton of carbs, which means they're not very efficient. Yes, they probably can be very, very fast because they are producing lots of lactate, but they're not going to be very efficient at any distance, and their time to fatigue is going to be pretty quick. So with this athlete, contrast that to the athlete in blue. This athlete is going to have almost no intensity. I mean, there are going to be some very, very short intervals, but this athlete has to keep everything under wraps. So we want to be training in this area here where there's still very, very low lactate production. By training here, it will shift the curve to the right a little bit. So knowing your lactate curve is helpful. And obviously, coaches, lactate testing has been around for forever. It's been around for a long time. Coaches instinctively kind of know what athlete they're working with by having them complete a power profile, by looking at past race efforts or race results. But your profile will significantly impact the type of training that you do. If you are here aerobically, it's going to be a lot more demanding for you, because if you're not using very much of your anaerobic system, you're depending a lot on your aerobic capacity. And so this athlete here it would be very typical for them to be overworked and just start to feel a huge amount of fatigue build up as their training load increases. And so obviously intensity is important for this athlete, but even then, when they're doing aerobic work, it's also important to keep their intensity dialed back, because if they're relying at, let's say, at race pace intensity, if they're relying on a huge component of their aerobic system, that's a huge stressor to the body. And let's take this athlete, for example. At race intensity, they're going to be using a lot of their aerobic system, but they also have a little bit of help from the anaerobic. And that's why it's always a play between aerobic and anaerobic. You want a little bit of assistance, but you don't want any one system to be overly dominant. Okay, so obviously in our sport, the aerobic system is going to be the dominant one, but you just don't want to rely on that too much. Anytime you can get help from the anaerobic, that's helpful. And how much help we get from the anaerobic is going to be determined by the profile that you have as far as your lactate production rate. So just a couple of thoughts. This is something that's important for your overall development. This curve changes significantly. If I look at my curve, let's say right now, as I'm building up for an Ironman, I am closer to this. And just for the sake of comparison here, I'm not saying I'm like this in the off season, but my curve is more like this than it is like this. I will never become this, okay? Because it's just my physiology. When I am rested, when I take time off from training, my lactate production rate goes through the roof and I become very inefficient as far as endurance goes. So your profiles will change significantly throughout the season, and that's the goal of training. Our goal of training is to develop an athlete who's aerobic, but not overly aerobic, that they have absolutely no help from the anaerobic system. So just a couple of thoughts, wanted to share that with you, let you know kind of some of the things that I look at with each of you as I work with you. If I've done a lactate test, a lactate building profile on you, I kind of know where you're at, whether you've tested with Inside or you've tested just with a standard lactate test. This gives me a lot of insight into what's going to benefit you the most for your training. Okay? Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know.